Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this special event. My name is Keith Brooks. I'm the Programs Director at Environmental Defense, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's talk, Clearing the Air, Pollution, Transportation, and Inequality. I'm filling in for our host today, Tim Gray, as he's away. I'll be co-hosting with our Clean Economy Program Manager, Sarah Buchanan.
Hello.
Today is the launch of the ReIGNITE Talks, a webinar series that's rethinking and reimagining our world. Each month, Environmental Defense Canada aims to make sense of the world from an environmental perspective. We'll hear from thought leaders and change makers on topics ranging from pollution to health to climate change, all while finding real-world solutions towards a sustainable future. If you don't know us, Environmental Defense is a leading Canadian advocacy organization that works with government, industry, and individuals to defend clean water, a safe climate, and healthy communities. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining this webinar from Toronto, the traditional, ancestral, and unsurrendered territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the rightful title holders and stewards of this land. I'd also like to acknowledge that we were invited to the Dish with One Spoon treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Today, we're calling in from different locations, and I encourage all of us who are non-Indigenous to learn about the land we're on today. As we start this webinar, let us keep in mind that it is Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by pollution, climate change, and environmental injustice. So with us today, we have, as I mentioned, my co-host, Sarah Buchanan, Clean Economy Program Manager here at Environmental Defense.
Hi.
And we also have two great guest speakers, Sabat Ismail, cycling advocate and member of Transportation Equity Toronto. Thanks for joining us, Sabat.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And also with us is Darnell Harris, the Executive Director of our Greenway Conservancy. Welcome, Darnell.
Good afternoon, it's a pleasure.
Before we get started, I just want to explain a bit about how the chat function works if you have some questions. If you're either joining us by YouTube or Facebook, in either place, you can see a chat box at the bottom or the right of your screen. Send us your questions in there. We usually get a large volume of questions, so we won't be able to answer them all, but we do try to make our best efforts to answer as many as possible. So with that, I'll hand it over to my co-host, Sarah Buchanan.
All right, thanks, Keith. So today we're going to be talking about something that most of us until recently did almost every day. We got on buses, or we got on our bikes, or we got in cars, and we headed off to work, or maybe to school, or to see family or friends. And then the pandemic hit and everything changed. So the changes that we've seen in how people travel and how clean our air is also have made us think about the opportunity to build long-term transportation solutions that are cleaner, that are healthier, and also that are more accessible to everyone. So over the past year, Environmental Defense has been working with allies in public health and also academic partners to analyze how air pollution from traffic impacts our health in and around Toronto. So today I'm going to talk more about these study results, but also about why it's so important that the communities who are most impacted by air pollution from traffic have a strong voice in the process to find clean transportation solutions. So today's panel, as Keith mentioned, will feature two guests who are working to address the inequitable access to transportation in Toronto and are involved in community-led transportation ideas in neighborhoods that are hit hard by traffic pollution. But first, I'm going to take a few minutes just to give some context to the problem of traffic pollution. And, I may not need to give this context for folks who, may have asthma or even folks who tried to just go for a run on a really hot, smoggy day when your lungs feel tight and, you can't get enough air. If you're standing close to a major road, maybe you can taste that metallic tinge to the air. And this pollution from traffic actually has a pretty big impact on our health. And chronic exposure to pollution from vehicles can make us really sick. In fact, it can cause premature deaths every single year, and it does. in places like Toronto and major cities, but also outside of major cities. And we also know now there's more research emerging that people who are exposed to higher levels of air pollution may actually be a greater risk of getting sick with COVID-19. And we also have to think about there's carbon pollution coming out of those same tailpipes from vehicles as the toxic air pollution. And that carbon pollution causes climate change impacts, which in the long term can really, really impact our health. And can cause heat waves like the one we're seeing in Toronto this week and last week and probably next week too. So for our recent study, I'll talk a little bit about that now. We zeroed in on the greater Toronto and Hamilton area to look at how traffic is polluting our air, but also where. And I want to give a quick shout out to our public health partners, the Ontario Public Health Association, and also the University of Toronto Transportation and Air Quality Research Group, who were a huge part of making this map happen, and all the other materials that you can find, which you can find at clearingtheair.ca. You can find all the wonderful materials that we produce there and more information. And also a shout out to the Atmospheric Fund for funding this project. So this map here shows pollution levels on a typical day in Toronto. And you can clearly see on this map, you can see the red areas, and the areas that are darker red are hotspots where there's more pollution. Not surprisingly, we see those around big highways. You can see a line where the 401 is. And you can also see there's a lot of air pollution where the 401 meets the 400, where it meets the Don Valley Parkway. In Hamilton, where we have highways meeting. And you can also see a big wide hotspot in Peel region, just west of Toronto. That's from a combination of highways, Pearson International Airport, and all the associated truck movement and goods movement that's coming from the airport to get all those things out on our roads to people. So for folks across the country, it's good to keep in mind that this pattern isn't unique to Toronto. Lots of major cities have a lot more air pollution close to roads and highways. And you can see here how where you live has a huge impact on how much harmful air pollution you're exposed to. And that has impacts on your health. So we know from a range of studies that lower income and marginalized communities are more likely to be located close to major roads and highways, and therefore are more likely to have higher exposures to air pollution. And this adds to the existing health inequities that we already see. And it means factors like income and race impact how much access you have to clean air. This also happens with air pollution from industrial sites. And these industrial sites are more often located near Indigenous communities or near racialized communities across Canada. So Chemical Valley in Sarnia near Aamjiwnaang First Nation is one example of this kind of environmental racism, where people are actively working to name and address this injustice as well. So let's talk about how we can start to change this dynamic and reduce pollution from traffic. Bottom line, we need to get cars and trucks and buses that are powered by gasoline and diesel off the road. And the simplest way to do this is just simply not traveling when we don't need to. Lots of folks now are discovering they can work from home, and maybe some folks don't have to get back in their cars and commute to an office every single day. And so that's a really simple example. But also when we do need to travel, just using technology that pollutes less or not at all, and also technology that makes sense for us, like bikes or transit or walking, or if we are using cars, electric vehicles. In fact, we studied electric vehicles for our analysis, and it showed that if every car in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area switched to electric, it would save over 300 lives every year. So it would avoid 300 premature deaths. And so a last point here, we can also plan our cities to provide these options to everyone where it makes sense to do so. But there's more to it than technology. So we also have to ask the question, who has access to all the solutions I just named? In many suburban communities close to highways, getting bike lanes or getting safe pedestrian infrastructure like stoplights installed can be a real uphill battle. So we tend to hear a lot also about electric vehicles as a transportation solution. They're definitely really important for reducing pollution because there's no tailpipe emissions from an electric vehicle. But also on the other side, the upfront cost is a big barrier to many people, and it adds up to there being less access to the transportation solutions that lead to cleaner air in places that are most affected by air quality. So now we're actually going to zoom in, and we're going to be hearing from some folks who are working on community-led solutions in neighborhoods that are more exposed to air pollution from traffic. And first up, we're going to be hearing from Darnell Harris. And Darnell is the executive director of our Greenway Conservancy. He's also a planner and a community advocate focused on breaking down barriers to mobility for all ages and abilities in Toronto's Northwest. So today, Darnell is going to be sharing some of the challenges in access and equity in clean transportation and highlighting some community-led solutions to combat these problems. So over to you, Darnell.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So in terms of the challenges that people have, the map that Sarah showed us the GTA, that as we can see, it's extremely polluted. The 401 lights up red, and the community in which we do our work within the northwest suburbs certainly has challenges with air pollution. People have challenges with mobility equity. People need to get around their community, and adding another car, even if they had one, which they don't necessarily do, isn't so much of a solution when the roads are already clogged. So the question becomes, how do you provide sustainable mobility for people that is still supporting their health as well as supporting the practical needs of the community? So in terms of what our Greenway is seeking to do, we are a community-focused conservancy. For people who are not familiar with what a conservancy is, the Bentway is an example of one. The Toronto Islands also is an example of one. And there's a legal structure around protecting the land that's there and using it for community use. What is our goal? Well, we're trying to build a practical mobility network to allow people and their goods to get from A to B. We are trying to address climate change and resiliency issues by having healthy trees and plants that are along the side of arterial roads. Usually, if you drive, you walk, or you bike along these arterial roads, you'll see trees that are crippled, that are not providing shade and providing the help that we need. And also fundamentally, we're trying to have people have safe streets where they have the tools they need to live their lives in a productive and helpful fashion. Next slide. So, of course, this is taken on Finch, but it really explains the challenge. Usually we tend to get into this, driver-cyclist dichotomy. And people in the suburban areas, which are very far from stores and shops, will correctly ask you, where am I going to put my groceries on that? Where am I going to put my kids on that? Where am I going to put my tools on that? How can I run a business on that? And, if that's the question between a small bike that doesn't carry much or anything at all and a car, people are going to choose the practical option that works for their lives and also will improve their standing in the community. Next slide. So one of the main challenges, of course, within a suburban framework is the suburbs were built so you'd be able to have stores in various locations that are at the corner of arterial roads. Jane and Finch, Kipling and Finch in this case, also Shepherd and Jane. But that was the idea. The idea is you'd get in your car and you would drive in a modern way to the shopping mall. Now, what does it mean if we have other ways to do that? All the yellow here in this map, the purple is all the industrial lands and factories, by the way. The yellow here is where people live. The orange is where the towers are. So what does it mean if you're trying to get from, a large section of the community to these important spaces that are on the arterial roads, be it to school, be it to work, be it to other options as well. Next slide, please. So what we're trying to do with the Mobility Greenway is provide a pathways along arterial roads, hydrocorridor connections where it makes sense, and provide mobility, really mobility solutions to the entire community. You know, just to provide a sense of scale on this map, if you were to go from Jane and Finch to Steeles and Jane, that would be half an hour to walk on a good day if you're lucky. Meanwhile, you could take a mobility device, quickly get there within around 7 or 8 minutes. Certainly that'd be a lot cheaper than a car and a lot faster than a bus and cheaper than a bus as well. So there's certainly more practical mobility options, and that's what we're trying to do. Make those arterial roads where you have those trucks and oil tankers, which are very important because they're an important part of the jobs in the community and what makes the community thrive to the current degree, but also how do we build from there. Next slide, please. So, you know, what would this look like? Considering it's a hot day, I figured a nice cooling winter scene would give you some relief. The Greenway picture here sort of just shows you what the future can be, in that you have a rain garden of healthy trees and plants. You have a wide pathway on each side of the street, allowing for cargo cycles and other sorts of devices to be there, including emergency vehicles. And then you allow for little parkettes where, you know, entrepreneurs can set up, where you can have community gathering spaces as well, which currently aren't available right now. You'd have to drive to make that sort of place happen. And last slide, please. So what are the options? When we speak of, you know, the sort of mobility that we're talking about, these are the kind of cycles that we'd like to see, that are able to, you know, for personal or business uses, be able to carry lots of goods. The ones on the left are more business cycles, and that's what we're currently doing. We're going to be having a cargo cycle pilot that allows us to trial some of these over the next couple of months. And in terms of the bike on the right there, that was a bike that I'm personally trialing right now. It's a Yuba, great company, and what they've created is a cargo cycle that can carry your goods. Yesterday I carried my aunt on the back. She needed to go to an errand, and then I was able to go and get groceries, load them on. Fundamentally, I will mention I have had over the last couple of months many people say how much they love this. And that's really what it is. It's providing practical solutions for the community. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Oh yeah, hi. Thanks so much, Darnell. You know, as I was looking at that bike, the cargo bike in particular, I was just thinking about like how many groceries I had to go and get during, you know, particularly during the pandemic when everyone's kind of stocking up, and how much more practical it would have been for me, and I'm sure many others, to have access to a cargo bike. So I think that's a really good point about, you know, solutions that actually are practical and work for people. And I also want to quickly reply. I think we got an audience question asking to clarify about the premature deaths that could be avoided with electric vehicles. And yes, that is just from switching gas-powered cars to electric cars, and that's just from transportation pollution. But also the cleaner trucks and buses as well make a big difference. So we can also save lives by electrifying buses in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area, and also by just getting cleaner trucks on the road. So I'm going to swap over to our next speaker. Next we'll be hearing from Sabat Ismail, and she is an active transportation advocate who's passionate about cycling and a member of Transportation Equity Toronto. And Sabat will first be sharing her views on the problems in access to clean transportation, and also who feels included in active transportation. Sabat, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. So I have, just to introduce myself and my involvement with Transportation Equity Toronto. I've been involved with Transportation Equity Toronto for about 2 years, and we work to try and bring an equity and intersectional lens to the way we talk about active transportation. And we've also been working to try and create a multidisciplinary network connecting suburban city builders, community organizations, and racialized suburban residents. And just to contextualize that and the demographics of Toronto and also its parallels to other North American cities. Racialized communities are increasingly being concentrated in the suburbs and predominantly like lower income racialized communities. And these like income divides are also like heightening over time. And that central areas of cities are increasingly getting access to more cycling infrastructure, but they're getting higher income, and there's a higher concentration of like white people in downtown cores, central areas of the cities in North America. And I want to and I've also been involved with a few other cycling organizations, and I'm going to talk about some of my work with them as well, and some of the insights that I've learned in like being involved with these different racialized suburban communities. So next slide, please. I want to talk about the impact of damage-based research to contextualize the frameworks that influence my thoughts and the work and research that I want to do in the future. And some of these dialogues around who uses active transportation in North America. So a transformative research concept that I learned was from my professors Cyrus Marcus Ware and Jin Harriet-Warren. It's a focus on desire as opposed to deficiency-based research. And the author of an open letter titled "Suspending Damage: A Letter to Communities" makes the recommendations to acknowledge the uneven power dynamics of research and not research in a way that views a group that's being researched as deficient or damaged, and that it's a framework, an alternative to damage-based research that has crafted histories of research, particularly with marginalized communities, and they particularly contextualize that in their experience as an Indigenous person and researcher and scholar. And they assert that the desire-based research frameworks are concerned with understanding complexity, contradiction, and the self-determination of our lived lives. That's their quote. And in my work as a cycling advocate, I see these things as connected because this framework is an important tool that allows us to understand that how certain discussions are framed that say, oh, why don't more people of color cycle? Those narratives inadequately grapple with realities. One, in that most cyclists in North America are people of color, and it also frames things in a way that views these cyclists in these communities and those who are maybe do not ride bikes as being deficient, and it doesn't adequately speak to our experiences, because I think that it's more powerful if these questions ask, how is cycling already meeting the needs of community members? How can that be expanded upon? How are people of color in these communities or lower income communities just currently organizing to encourage cycling? Because this is already happening in these communities. And it's also important because the initial question that I asked is also why don't people of color cycle, is also not a good question, because it implicates residents as at fault when they often have limited social spheres of influence to be able to as easily get some cycling infrastructure in their communities. And I also want to move on now, next slide please, and talk about my experience with different community cycling organizations. And so there are a few different community bike organizations across the world and across North America and Canada. And the Center for Active Transportation has aided in the creation of suburban bike hubs that work to encourage cycling outside the town core, and I've been involved with a few of them. And these community bike hubs offer do-it-yourself bike mechanic spaces and other cycling education programming in Toronto. And now they've they're in other parts of the Greater Toronto Area as well. And this programming offers a way of connecting potentially around shared interests to support cycling. For example, taking a health focus and from there building connections with different health organizations, because a lot of the host organizations for the Community Bike Hub and the partnerships that host the hubs, as well as help to sustain funding and hire staff, a lot of them are done through community health centers, and as well as settlement agencies. So that's a powerful way of building connections around shared interests and around sustainable transportation. And meaningful community involvement is also something that's really important. And just because these spaces exist in these communities doesn't necessarily mean that there may be meaningful community involvement, equitable programming. It's important that that's something that's always strived towards. For example, I see this in the different work programming that I've done, encouraging or working to support women trans, gender nonconforming hours. I've done this at Bike Pirates for a few years, and I also did this in other bike spaces. And women cycle and walk in cities up to 40% less. And I oftentimes am thinking about how we can get more women and girls active as well. Next slide, please. Women and girls active, but how can we also be cognizant of the ways in which we experience a lack of safety, and not just uniformly have programming that may not as easily make women feel comfortable in the space, and other people of marginalized identities in the space. Especially I found with like do-it-yourself mechanic spaces, there's oftentimes the assumption that you should know things going in, and that's something that I've noticed inhibits women and girls more than boys and men. And I also, one thing that I did want to talk about is how at Bike Pirates during their Women in Trans hours, I would oftentimes notice that like sometimes volunteers would refer women, presenting people that would come in and recommend that they come on Women in Trans Sundays, and that kind of works against the space that we try to hold. It's important to try to integrate equity into all the different spaces, and also not have Women in Trans programming that just happens on the day that the shop is less busy, because that all works against the objective of equity. And yeah, I could talk more about those experiences now, but I just wanted to wrap up that by also saying that we also have to be conscious of the power dynamics of the work when we're especially working in marginalized communities and working on funding and supporting what already exists, and be aware of the power dynamics of, for example, a conversation with different community bike organizations that happens is that do-it-yourself spaces, a lot of them are located in racialized communities, and a lot of them are predominantly run by white people. So, and are we having, and it's important to ask, are the residents of this community coming into the space? There's a whole thing with respect to who has the time to even volunteer in these spaces. So there's all those complexities, but we have to be aware of them in order to like work to dismantle them, have equitable programming, and try to more broadly translate that into our society. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Sabat. And just while I have you here, I just wanted to ask a quick follow-up question of, you're mentioning how important it was that having like a Women in Trans space at Bike Pirates, like a local community cycling hub, how important it was for you and for many people. Do you know of any other examples of programs that are working, programs that are helping to make active transportation more accessible, that that can be, I guess, replicated elsewhere?
I think that maybe even it's hard to apply different models into different contexts, because, and I'm sure that there are also different organizations like doing work that wants to make it so that their people in their communities are more mobile, are healthier. So I think building around those shared interests. But an interesting example that I think is really great is Bike Host, which I know now it's moved to outside of Toronto and other parts of the Greater Toronto Area, but it would provide mentorship opportunity for newcomers to Toronto, and that definitely also now the Greater Toronto Area, and that speaks to like the Greater Toronto Area as being a space with a large newcomer population and always newcomers coming into the city and the metro area. So that speaks to that context. And then they'd make partnership with other organizations in the different neighborhoods where Bike Host was. So I think that's like a really unique and great thing. And then there's also a bunch of different riding groups that take place in that I know of and that I've been involved in that take place in different parts of North America, particularly those for women and trans people. And then there are also ones for people of color. So I think providing them resources, maybe providing them bikes, that building upon what's already there is really important.
Yeah, really good point. I actually had the opportunity to participate in the Bike Host program as a mentor, and it was just like, I think it's such a rewarding experience for everyone. And I feel like I also just got to know more people in my community where I live and in my neighborhood who were new to Toronto, who I could hang out with also. So it was a good neighborhood building opportunity, as well as a way, I think, to help make active transportation more accessible. So I'm going to we're gonna actually answer some audience questions in just a minute, but I want to bring Darnell into the conversation as well, because I just have one kind of burning question to ask while we're all here. And so thanks, first of all, to everyone in the audience who has asked questions. We've seen them, we've heard them, and we are getting to them. We've got lots of time for them. And thank you to our speakers, Sabat, Ismail, and Darnell Harris as well. So Sabat and Darnell, my burning question that I want to ask is just simply, why is it important to bring communities into transportation planning and to have community-led solutions?
Sabat, do you want to go first?
Okay. I think that it's really important because of it's also kind of context specific, but if we're talking about transportation planning,
Mom,
how
if the chair calls me.
how transportation planning has been really harmful to marginalized communities, communities of color, Black communities, like particularly. And so it's important to work to rectify that, especially as we're having like these conversations in these moments, even though we should have been having them before. But that's really important. And it's something I just also want to comment on. It is also important to be aware of, like, again, the power dynamics, and also, are you compensating people because they have knowledge that you are ideally that you hope to integrate into your work, but how are we adequately compensating them for that, especially people that are more marginalized and have less access to resources? That's really important.
Yeah, great points. Darnell, do you want to jump in?
Yes, please. So apologies, pandemic life. So certainly a lot of the challenges just around mobility have to do with just access and opportunity, and that's very briefly primarily what we need to be providing people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great point. So I'll go to some audience questions now. We got some questions about cargo bikes, so maybe Darnell, I'll direct those to you. Just kind of on the logistics, like, are they for rent? How can you get them in Toronto? Are they good in winter, in icy conditions? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. We will be having a cargo bike library, so yes, people will be able to rent, lease them, and try them out. We're going to be looking into announcing some more details and looking into building that. If you go to our Greenway on Twitter, we'll certainly be releasing more information there. In terms of winter, yes, certainly bikes and trikes are perfect options for winter. A lot of people, especially older people, want to use a three-wheeled bike because it's perfectly stable in that way. But the key thing is, no matter how many wheels you have, is that you have a clear pathway and a comfortable pathway. So, just yesterday I was on that bike that I showed you, and I could more or less feel every bump and divot in the road, because of course, that's just the reality of any path. Except what we'd like to have with a Conservancy is a well-maintained path, and that's a key part of it, is being able to keep quality for the community.
Yeah. And how do these devices, like cargo bikes and scooters, do they integrate with transit? How do they replace transit for some people? Do they replace cars? Where does that fit in the spectrum of people's decisions?
Sure. Definitely it's a toolbox, in that when, usually, as I said during my presentation, if you give people the choice between a bike that carries nothing and a car that carries everything but is possibly too much, people will choose what they know can do the job. So the key thing with the cargo bikes is being able to give people options, crucially, and being able to sort of, fill in the middle options. There are many different types of cargo bikes. As I showed you, 2-wheel, 3-wheel, 4-wheel, different capacities. And it's just being able to choose the option that works for you.
Another really good question here. How about offering bike traffic training and certifications in schools? I see the lack of knowledge and application of traffic rules by cyclists as one of the challenges for broad use of bicycles. I mean, this is also something sometimes I hear from people saying, oh, cyclists need to learn more, blah, blah, blah. Any comments on that?
I'd like to comment on that. I was also an instructor with the Bike to School project last summer. Something I would say, though, even as I got my CAN Bike Level 4 certification, you're riding, and I would ride into the low suburban communities in Toronto that are on the peripheries, and I wouldn't feel safe. So I think that we also problematize vulnerable road users, and also something that concepts like Vision Zero forth is that accidents or collisions will happen, but that because we have unsafe, the built environment encourages people to drive unsafely, encourages people to speed. There are higher speed limits. That makes it so that these collisions that happen are fatal or cause grave injury to people. So it's more than just, and oftentimes, I think that we also should get away from a cyclist versus cars type of kind of discourse that's not super productive. So those are my thoughts. Darnell, do you have anything you want to add?
Sure. People often forget that 100 years ago, at the dawn of the automotive age, streets were quite literally for people.
Yeah.
It's still the case in many countries around the world. Was the case in North America. The street was where you played with your friends. The street was where you set up your stall. The street had many other uses, and then they were legislated out in favor of being able to have lots of cars go very fast. So we've built our streets for that, and it comes a question of what do we do to move forward from here. But this is where I think especially cargo cycles offer a good option, because you often hear planners and other people say, we should rebuild our communities. Okay, it's a great comment, but it took decades to do that, and we need solutions right now. So it will be a lot easier to rebuild our street sides to allow for safe transport and then sort of re-envision what this looks like, than say, let's rebuild our communities, which will take decades further, because right now we're in a situation where we need to retrofit what we have while we can speak about rebuilding and reimagining the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and speaking of solutions now, there has been a lot of talk about getting more, for example, cycling infrastructure in place. We've seen, COVID-19 has sparked more folks cycling and wanting to get out and active. We've seen in Toronto, the lakeshore shut down for temporarily anyway for cycling infrastructure, more bike lanes getting approved. Do you think that this will help in the long term? And also, what are some government policies that could be put in place to help really move things forward and also make these options more accessible?
I guess I'll make a brief comment on that, and Sabat, if you'd like to continue. The challenge with what we're building right now is for a very different ideal user. In that, when engineers design standards, they design to an ideal user. Right now, their ideal user is one person on an exercise bike going really, really fast in a narrow lane, usually a man. The trouble is, of course, in order to really speak about who moves in our communities, there needs to be consideration of kids, there needs to be consideration of women, there needs to be consideration of seniors. And also there needs to be consideration that not all your goods are going to be moving on the road now. There's an opportunity for them to be moving in the same pace and space with other cycles. So there is now a very clear use case to speak about how we're expanding our cycle pathways, because they're accommodating more than they were ever thought they could. About?
I wanted to say that also, it's important to look at who is getting access to these facilities and these open streets and who isn't. And I also think it's important to note, even if these streets come into marginalized communities and neighborhoods, it's also a question of how will you build trust in this time, especially where transportation planning has been used in marginalized communities, and how we've consulted communities have made people feel like their voices don't matter, and already seeing how initially places that have mapped out in communities that are more transit reliant and where there's already people taking photos on the transit and showing in my community, this is how crammed we are on Street. That's a corridor in Toronto, and it goes from northwest to all the way a really long street in the city. So it's also important to consider how can we build community trust in this moment, and how do we not continue to perpetuate harm by bringing into these projects into these communities. And also, I'll just briefly say, a lot of places don't have access. People don't have access to bikes, don't have access to bike shops. Organizations like Scarborough Cycles were started in Scarborough because there was one bike shop in Scarborough, and now a lot of these community bike hubs are closed. And even a lot of women in the community I encountered when I was working in Thorncliffe Park, they didn't know how to ride. So these are all these barriers to equity that result in people not having access to bikes, for it to not even really be a viable option at this point. So yeah, all these barriers to access.
Yeah. I'm going to ask one question, another audience question here. I think we've spoken to this a little bit, but I think it's a really good question. On a policy level, how will public spaces and public transport be made safer for people in marginalized communities?
Sure. So, I'll speak to it from a Conservancy perspective. The really only way we can do that is to make investments in quality that allow people to live within their local communities. We tend to spend a lot of time focusing on commuting to work. The Transportation Tomorrow survey is very clear. 75% of trips taken are within communities on a daily basis. They are short. We know this. And especially these days, when people aren't going downtown nearly as much as they used to at the beginning of the year, there becomes a very important conversation that we need to have. And specifically, that be, how do we maintain things for local communities? With a Conservancy, one of the benefits is that you can have local trust, and that you can have opportunities for further input and ongoing engagement with a community-run organization, which is fundamentally what we would be providing within the City of Toronto.
And I just wanted to quickly say, if we want public spaces to be safe for people, like we have to really atone for histories of public spaces being unsafe for people and why that is. And also, you know, recognizing that people have unequal access to safety in public space, have unequal access to green space. So it's difficult, but we also have to, if we're working towards change, we have to be cognizant of these realities and like work to do better.
Mm-hmm.
And also center planners that have already been, if we're talking about planning, planners that have already had practices centering equity in the work that they're doing. I think that's important as well. And also like crediting them for their work, compensating them for their work, all of that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Just having it go all the way up to planning out communities, not just talking about, you know, what actual lines we're painting on the road, but also how planning practices are incorporating all these questions.
Yeah, Sarah, I can't tell you how many times I've been told by people within the city of Toronto, within the city limits of Toronto, who are doing work in the Northwest. You know, we just don't have time to go up there. As if up there was, you know, Nunavut or some other place, and yet they're doing work on the project. How can you understand the soul of a place? How can you understand what the place needs and still work on them without going there?
Yeah, totally.
There's transit. It's an hour.
Yeah.
People do it every day.
So we have about about like 1 minute left before we have to close here. And thank you both so much. It's been amazing just having a conversation and hearing your presentations and insights. I wanted to just ask one final thing. If you can just really kind of sort of top line quickly, give me one highlight from your experience when you've seen a community come together to improve transportation in their neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. You know, for me, part of it, I guess, go back a couple of years when I was doing some initial work on this, what would become the Greenway Conservancy at CW Jeffries. And we had a role play where we invited students to be, students to be their parents, teachers to be youth, and sort of exchange roles and community members to become what was a very diverse city council, and come together to sort of discuss and engage. And really what was inspiring from that and the conversations that happened after that with seniors and other members of the community was just how rich the dialogue is and how rich the local understanding is of, their challenges and what would be able to address their needs. The real, input that often tends to go unheard because it tends to come off in dialogue quite often is, look, we need practical solutions to our challenges. What can you offer us? And that's what it is that people, most people, for example, have never seen a cargo cycle. They see it, it makes sense. And that's really, I think, what we have to do is engage in dialogue, show people practical solutions. And that's what I've really found personally the most heartening about this is just the willingness to engage in that dialogue around practicality.
Totally. Sabat, any last thoughts?
One community that I saw that was doing really amazing work was in Thorncliffe Park, Naja Zawari. She's been organizing community members with the Women's Cycling Network. And something that I thought was really amazing is that she then connected with Evergreen and then got women that are interested in cycling. And they're newcomer women, Afghani and some Iranian. And it reminded me of seeing my mom, because she doesn't ride a bike, and it's there are all these barriers, her being a Black woman, her being a hijabi, to being able to feel confident safely taking up public space. And it just really inspired me, seeing those women doing those doing that kind of organizing and riding bikes, and how they all then came and like wanted to they took a build a bike class, and then they then wanted racks installed on their bikes because they were making all these trips that, you know, a lot of women make trips where they stop and do various things. So I found that really heartening and inspiring that, like, you know, community members are interested in organizing for these things. How can we get them the resources that that they need to get around safely?
Yeah. Thank you so much to both of you for your thoughts, and thanks to everyone in our audience as well. So that's it for me and for our speakers. I'm going to pass the mic back over to my co-host Keith Brooks, and he's going to give us some final parting thoughts and information. So thanks, Sabat, and thank you so much, Darnell. And we've got lots more information that's going to come out in an email.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and thanks to Sabat and Darnell. That was a great conversation, and it sounds to me like there's a lot of promising and inspiring things happening in terms of mobility and making a break from our car-dependent society. But there's still a ways to come in terms of reducing pollution and really meeting the needs of communities in terms of increasing safety and ensuring equity and access for everyone. Please do take an opportunity to check out our report, Clearing the Air. It's up on the Environmental Defense website, but also it can be found at clearingtheair.ca. It contains all of those maps that Sarah showed with the amount of pollution caused by vehicles in the GTHA. And we'll be sending you a follow-up email with a link to that report and more information about the initiatives that our speakers are connected with and how you can connect with them. Today's talk was the first of our new series, the ReIGNITE Talks. It's a monthly webinar series offered by Environmental Defense, and each month we'll be digging into a top environmental news story, and we'll be bringing thought leaders and change makers to share their analysis of the issue and explore real-world solutions towards a sustainable future. So please do stay tuned for next month's talk. I want to take this moment to thank all of Environmental Defense's supporters for tuning in today. For the talk and for your thoughtful questions. It's encouraging to see so many of you taking action and tuning in and keeping up the momentum to protect the environment even during these challenging times. Finally, thanks once again to our speakers, to Darnell Harris and Sabat Ismail, for their expertise and insights. You can get in touch with them on Twitter, and as I said in the follow-up email, we'll share some more information about how you can find them and the initiatives that they're involved with. Please do also stay in touch with us on Twitter, on Facebook. Feel free to send us an email, and thanks everyone very much, and goodbye.